The story begins with a horrific murder. A blade strikes a woman who has just been interrogated in the neck, taking her life. Afterwards, a knight of the Nosterian Empire brutally plunges his bloody sword into the body of his headless victim. Nearby, behind a column, Beatrice watched silently. Her knees buckled and her hand trembled with fear. She knew what death was, but she had never seen someone deliberately take a life. The knight was clearly looking for her, the black-haired princess who was no longer needed in this palace. There was nowhere else to run, as the column could not hide her for long. Besides, the place was already swarming with knights. Taking a deep breath, the girl came out of hiding to confess that she was their target. Beatrice's voice sounded calmer than she thought. The knight's gaze fell on her, and a satisfied smile froze on his lips. Slowly approaching, he held his sword confidently on his shoulder. The knight mocked the princess, asking if she wanted to live. After all, what was the point if her husband had sold her along with the kingdom, as if she were some kind of object? Beatrice did not want to die, but if that was her fate, then she would rather they do it quickly and spare her servants. She did not want those who had cared for her all her life to meet the same fate. A majestic man with an aristocratic aura approached them. The knight asked what to do with the princess, who still wanted to live. Beatrice realized that she was standing before the commander of the Knights of the Empire of Nostero, Alessandro Graham. His presence was powerful, and a cold light shone in his eyes. He was dressed in heavy armor that could not be pierced by any weapon. Yet the man was not as noble as he seemed. Beatrice noticed bloodstains splattered across his armor. And despite how many times he had smelled the sharp scent of red liquid, it still made him feel sick. He had never been able to get used to it. Nevertheless, without hesitation, as if eager to leave this place, he gave the order to kill the princess and hang her head on the castle gate. These words from the mouth of the cruel conqueror were engraved in Beatrice's memory. Alexandro pondered the words of his right-hand man, Evan. The latter suggested leaving Princess Beatrice alive, because as Gilbert's wife, she could become part of his plan. It seemed like a clever plan: capture her and decide what to do later. Alexandro trusted Evan, who was known for his cunning and strategic thinking. He was persuasive and always expressed reasonable opinions. The commander cast an appraising glance at the petite woman standing before him. She was not destined for the throne, and Beatrice was lucky to have been found last. Moreover, the princess's dark hair and eyes indicated that she was illegitimate. Therefore, her children would not inherit the platinum locks of the royal family of Elpus. When Alexandros left, Evan gave the order. He sternly proclaimed that the princess should be captured, her servants enslaved, and the rest killed. Beatrice sighed heavily. She had to prepare herself for the familiar life she was about to live again. Chancellor Gilbert of Elpus wanted to attract the attention of a powerful man. He believed that with the riches of the land and his help, they would be able to dramatically increase the empire's taxes. The dwarf had no doubt that, once he became Lord of Elpus, he would be able to use this to his advantage. He was not afraid to betray the kingdom, his friend the king, and even Princess Beatrice, his wife. Gilbert was super proud to join forces with the Grahams, the most influential aristocratic family in the Nostero Empire. His betrayal would go down in history, but the Chancellor didn't regret his actions at all. After all, he had been promised half of Elpus's territory and the posthumous title of Lord as his reward. Alexandros did not like Gilbert's small, shining eyes, which revealed nothing but greed. The commander suddenly proposed a deal in which Princess Beatrice would be used as collateral. Although he had not yet asked the question, it was clear that Gilbert would refuse. The Chancellor was surprised that his wife was still alive. The short man's eyes suddenly widened and his fat hands began to sweat. Gilbert contemptuously remarked that the princess was not the Empress's daughter and was only half a member of the royal family, so he did not care about her. The Chancellor also suggested killing all members of the Elpus family to eliminate the threat. Alexander Graham listened to these suggestions with disgust. Gilbert spoke about his wife without any compassion. All that interested this short man was the land he had been promised. Alexander hated people like Gilbert, and soon announced that if he did not want his wife, the Empire would take her as a military slave. In the small dungeon where Beatrice and her maids were imprisoned, cries could be heard. Unlike the princess, the other women were accustomed to a peaceful life, so slavery was a real tragedy for them. They were afraid that they would be treated like cattle. Beatrice tried to comfort them, explaining that, although it seemed now as if the world had collapsed, one day they would be grateful for having survived. It seemed funny, a slave princess trying to calm her subordinates. Lucy, who had supported Beatrice during her transition from slavery to aristocracy, declared that she could not serve the empire. Lumi intervened, claiming that Beatrice was only accepting this fate because of her past. Although Beatrice's life had not been easy. After 2 years in the palace, her father promised her to Chancellor Gilbert. 23 years in slavery had been happier for her than 2 as a princess. She thanked the maids for their support. Then she smiled and asked them not to treat her like a noble lady anymore. Some were shocked, but most remained silent. Hearing a man's voice, their breathing quickened and fear was reflected in their eyes. They would always remember the face that had taken the lives of so many in the mansion. He was a psychopath, as his actions proved. The man smiled and said that they should celebrate their return to slavery, and his eyes reflected insane joy as he looked at Beatrice. Alexandro informed his assistant of his decision regarding the princess, raising a glass of red wine. Elpus was destroyed, and tomorrow he would return to the empire, wanting to quickly finish his business and rest. Evan was shocked to learn that the princess would be sent to the empire as a slave. Beatrice, the wife of the traitor Gilbert, had a special status, but in Alexandro's opinion, she would be more useful alive. The assistant realized the mistake of the decision. He believed that killing the princess was better than letting her become the cause of a rebellion, but Alexandros was adamant, since Beatrice's child would not be recognized as a member of the royal family. Evan couldn't understand why Alexandros was showing such generosity toward Beatrice. He wondered if she would ever decide to take revenge. Despite his doubts, he kept them to himself because the commander was never wrong. Perhaps it was simply sympathy for the princess, who had suffered from her husband's betrayal. Evan knew that Alexandros hated people like Gilbert, who sought absolute power in the empire. Alexandro had a complicated relationship with his father Duncan, and was tired of fighting for power. The war was a kind of escape from the capital for him, and his stern face confirmed it. A ball was being prepared in the empire to honor the victorious return of the knights and their commander. Mr. Graham showed no interest in the celebration. Evan, understanding this without words, spread rumors about Alexander's coronation as Archduke. He couldn't hold back a sly smile, because the news was familiar, although his father's eccentricity made it completely unexpected. Duncan decided to reward his son with a fictitious title for his refusal to take the throne. The ball was to be special, as the Nostros Empire had finally conquered the entire continent, and with the fall of the last kingdom, Elpus, peace, had come. Evan emphasized that this time Alexander must be present. Leo roughly pulled Beatrice out of the dungeon, and before she had time to look around, knights surrounded her, waiting for the spectacle to begin. One of them was intrigued by her black hair, not only on her head, and demanded that she remove her clothes. The girl, feeling ashamed, wondered if these men were really knights, because their cruelty frightened her. She knew they wanted to mock her, but she felt that something worse could happen. Leo smiled, and said he would do something else first. Without letting go of Beatrice, he turned abruptly and tore her bodice. Now, covering her breast with her hands, she looked at him with anger and humiliation. The man smiled sinisterly and said that she was no longer a princess, but a slave marked with a brand. Leo slowly approached the fire, pulling out a thick iron rod that was glowing bright red. Despair washed over her like a cold wave as she realized there was no way out. Suddenly, the wall behind her spoke. It was Evan. He explained to Leo that slaves of war belonged to the Imperial court. Therefore, they could not be used without permission, which made Leo wonder about his true intentions. Elpus did not divide its slaves into classes, and as a former slave, Beatrice had no special status or privileges. In the Empire, her fate could have terrible consequences. Leo's words about Beatrice filled her with disgust. She hoped for Alexander's help, but he remained indifferent to their conversation. Although Evan refused Leo, his words were cold and merciless. The knight bit his lip and turned back to Beatrice, promising that he would return to his plans if she waited a little longer. His touch was painful, but the girl tried to avoid his gaze. Suddenly he grabbed her by the hair and pressed himself against her ear, leaving a bite that hurt more than the blows. Tears streamed down the princess's face, and Leo laughed and threw her violently to the floor. Beatrice wondered, was it really better to survive than to die? She could only hope that tomorrow would never come. The girl sat in the corner of the dungeon and watched the knights bustling around her. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud cry, which made Beatrice freeze like a doll. It was announced that the last princess had been found. Alicia appeared before everyone. She, who had always looked down on Beatrice, now had a look of horror on her face. The other knights surrounded the princess, making a lot of noise, but Evan did not intervene. Beatrice recognized his voice when he asked where Alicia had been found. He was the same knight who, according to her instinct, had made her look away so as not to attract his attention. The man reported that the princess had been hiding in a warehouse, skillfully covered with snow. Alexandro, looking coldly at Alicia, gave the order: behead her and hang her on the castle gates. Alicia couldn't stand his indifference. When he turned away, she couldn't hold back her anger. The girl remembered the marriage proposal her father had made to Alexandro, but in the end it had been cancelled. Exploding, the princess screamed, accusing him of treason with Gilbert. However, Alexander simply ignored her. She continued to talk about the cruel Duncan and compare him to an insect. His presence was more depressing than that of any armed knight. He mercilessly asked Alicia why she was complaining. She couldn't say a word, realizing that her life depended on him. Alexandra replied that the helpless kingdom of Elpus was to blame for everything that had happened. Hearing these words, Alicia, filled with courage, spat in his face, shocking everyone present. In the silence, the princess instantly realized the consequences of her actions. Alexandro coldly declared that he had changed his mind, making Alicia feel hopeless. She tried to break free from the knight's grip, but her efforts were in vain. He ordered his sword to be brought to him, then took it and pointed the blade at her neck. The princess trembled with fear and could not speak. The weapon cut the young lady's skin, and a thin stream of blood began to flow down her body. When Alexandro said that he would show Alicia mercy by simply cutting off her head, the princess's body shuddered. She shook her head frantically, while the lustful glances of the knights were fixed only on her. Alicia screamed in despair, trying to break free from the guard's hands, and fell to her knees before the commander. When Alexandros lifted the girl by the arm and thrust his sword into her, she felt all her strength leave her. The knights regarded the princess as a trophy of a defeated people. When Alicia died, Alexandros ordered her to be hung on the gate. Then he walked away from her dead body without any remorse. The realization that the same thing could have happened to her caused Beatrice to immediately lose consciousness, but suddenly she felt a light tap on her shoulder. Turning around, the princess saw Lucy. The maid, trembling with fear, tried to embrace Beatrice. However, this sudden movement alerted the others. The girl panicked when she met the eyes of the terrifying commander. It lasted only a moment, but she didn't dare breathe. Fortunately, he turned away with an indifferent look, probably not even realizing what had happened. She sighed with relief, because that was enough to scare her. Beatrice had no idea when Alexandros would change his mind and kill her, so she tried not to stand out. All the maids were tied up and taken to the Imperial capital. Beatrice could barely walk, afraid of fainting. The girl wondered if she would ever have a chance to be happy. Her past life had been meaningless, and her present life was one long ordeal. After failing her exams, she returned to college and became a veterinarian at the age of 35. Having failed to achieve any of her dreams, she soon died in an accident. In her new life, immediately after birth, a foreign slave, still an infant, gave her daughter to the slaves of an apothecary. She was named Chloe. The girl was reborn in the Middle Ages, in the kingdom of Elpus, with memories of her past life. And even though she found herself in the body of a lower-class person, she was still happy to have another chance at life. Every time Chloe remembers that period of her life that ended in failure, she tries to live so that she will have no regrets when she dies again. Even as a slave, she strove to be skilled in reading and writing. She was happy until, at the age of 23, the first king she had ever met came to her and said he was her father. He took Chloe away, and she became a princess. That is how she became Beatrice. One day, the richest man in Elpus and a friend of the king, Gilbert, announced that he wanted to marry the princess. Instead of his 2 biological daughters, the king sent his illegitimate daughter. She was born as a result of a chance night with a slave, so her dark hair was different from that of the royal family. At first, Gilbert was dissatisfied, but after looking closely, he realized that she was quite pretty. For 2 years, Beatrice's married life was a nightmare. She thought that death was better than such a fate. But then, the army of the Neustrian Empire captured Elpus and killed the king and his wife. The princesses, Beatrice's stepsisters, were not spared. If the girl had been of pure royal blood, she would have been hanged along with everyone else. Her marriage to Gilbert seemed cruel, and the life of a military slave turned out to be hell. The trip to the capital lasted over a week and was difficult. Chloe, who was used to being an optimist, completely lost hope. She looked for Leo and Alexandros, not knowing when they would return to entertain her. The terrible death of Princess Alicia haunted the girl in her dreams, giving her no peace. Chloe felt even more tense when she saw the huge and much more developed capital of the empire than she had expected. It was her first trip outside her home country. Upon arrival, they were subjected to a procedure of being turned into slaves. The empire had a tradition of conquering different peoples, so the laws regarding prisoners were clear. Women lost their property and titles. Chloe became a slave, and no one called her princess anymore. She accepted her new position as an improvement. She also thanked fate that she had not suffered the same fate as her sisters. Evan divided the slaves into 2 groups. One joined the Order of Knights, and the other became part of his family. Chloe became a slave to Evan's family, but the terrible image of Leo still haunted her from time to time. Recently, the pitiful knight had looked at her with lustful desire. Chloe remembered how he had said he would take care of her as soon as he saw her again, and these thoughts filled her with anxiety. Since arriving at the palace, the former princess had been glad not to see him. She wished she would never meet that crazy knight or their captain again, praying constantly to God for salvation. Becoming a slave, Chloe immediately cut her hair, because on this continent, a girl with dark hair was considered exotic, and she did not want to face the undesirable consequences as happened to Leo. She put on the pants of a young slave. Chloe did not seek to disguise herself as a man. She simply did not want to look feminine. Fortunately, she was sent to a pharmacy, where she performed minor tasks and cleaned. Aaron, Evan's brother, was not suited to the role of an army officer, but his intelligence and dedication allowed him to become a butler and assist Alexander. At the moment, the man was most concerned about the disputes in the Graham family. During the title ceremony, Aaron was annoyed by the attitude of father and son towards each other. Alexandra sat indifferently in his office, drinking wine frivolously and not planning to attend the festive evening. Although he sometimes went out, he never went to the Imperial palace where his father lived. Alexandros disliked the hustle and bustle and formalities associated with Nosteros and did not want to meet Duncan. Aaron informed him that His Highness had invited his son to breakfast, but the commander refused sharply. The butler also tried to convince him to stay in the capital because of urgent work related to taxes. But Alexandros was determined to return to his estate after training the knights. He considered the order to be the only thing that mattered to him, because his friends were there and he did not have to take part in intrigues. The butler advised his master to attend tomorrow's dinner, as his father had announced his intention to marry off his son. Despite the fact that people regarded the commander as a war hero, Duncan boldly decided his son's fate. The man laughed at the situation because his father, a self-proclaimed emperor, was deciding his future. Aaron was alarmed that without expressing his dissatisfaction, the wedding could be arranged without the commander's consent. The title of Archduke became a burden for Alexander, and he saw no point in contradicting his father's will. Therefore, he suggested that Aaron convey on behalf of his master that he had fallen in love with one of the knights. The commander noted that Leo was perfect for this role, to which Aaron only laughed. Outwardly, Alexandros seemed like a cold-blooded warrior, but in reality he was kind-hearted and cared for his subordinates. Although his family history had made him indifferent to women and power, he did not hide his love for his loved ones. Leaving the office, Aaron said with a serious look that Sir Chris was supposed to be the favourite. A week passed. While most of the slaves were doing hard labour, Chloe was assigned to cleaning and considered it a great stroke of luck, as there was not much work and the daily routine was simple. She worked in the infirmary pharmacy, which belonged to a night training school near the palace. All the doctors were men, and most of the nurses were women. Fortunately, none of them asked Chloe her name. The pharmacy required less cleaning than the ward or the examination room, as it was intended for storing and dispensing prescription drugs. One day she came across a door labelled Medicine Storage. The room was locked, so it remained inaccessible to the girl. But curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to try to open the door by quietly turning the handle. The door gave way. Inside, there were tons of medicines and ingredients. Chloe thought that the pharmacy where she worked in El Paso had the largest collection of medicines, but even that couldn't compare to this one. The storeroom was large and very dirty, making her nose wrinkle. Everything was in disarray, and she wondered how a pharmacy could function in such conditions. Open bottles, despite their sensitivity to oxidation, confirmed this. Chloe lost track of time as she looked around the room. She checked every medication and finally realized that she had organized the entire warehouse. She continued to work in the closet, trying not to attract attention. Reorganizing the medicine storage room proved to be difficult, but her inspiration was fueled by resources she had never seen before. Suddenly, a voice behind her caught her attention. It was Jorge George, the deputy head of the infirmary, who asked her what she was doing there. Chloe apologized and explained that she was cleaning up. The man, known as an outstanding doctor, looked around the warehouse, completely ignoring the slave girl. He couldn't understand how anyone could treat medicine like that, since she was neither a doctor nor a nurse, and considered it a serious crime. Jorge sighed in confusion and asked if Chloe had organized the inventory. The girl said that she had previously been a slave in a pharmacy. She hoped that this would impress him and he would allow her to work. The doctor couldn't understand how an illiterate slave had classified all the items. He also wondered how Chloe knew the names, uses, and dosages of all the medicines without being able to read or write. In El Paso, most slaves and ordinary people were illiterate, but Chloe, working with doctors and pharmacists, kept accounts and wrote prescriptions, and learned to read and write through herbal medicine. The doctor had never met slaves with such an education. Trying to remain calm, he remarked that Chloe would be punished for entering the warehouse. She was not afraid, even though she was acting on her own initiative and at her own risk, albeit with good intentions. When Jorge asked her name, the girl hesitated, as no one had ever asked her that before. She realized that she no longer wanted to have the name of a noblewoman, so after a short pause, she replied that her name was Chloe. The Archduke practiced sword fighting diligently. The image of his mother kept appearing in his memories. This depressed the man, because the woman who should have been closest to him hated him. This was because the young Alexander reminded her more and more of Duncan. Sophia, as the woman was called, loved neither her husband nor her son. She cursed the day she agreed to give birth to the child. This was traumatic for the boy, so when he grew up, he tried to break this emotional bond as if with a sword. Perhaps Sophia had instilled in her son a feeling of contempt for all women and a fear of intimacy. The butler waited for over an hour for his master to return from training and greet Lord Vendar's daughter. Aaron insisted on seeing the woman, but he was immersed in the affairs of the duchy. He understood that if information about the Duke's daughter's visits to the unmarried Archduke spread, it would damage his reputation. Lady Clara Vendors regularly wrote love letters to Alexander. Receiving no reply, she began to visit him every week, always at 3:00, confidently displaying her wealth. Aaron could not refuse the Duke's daughter's entertainment, as it could compromise his master. Despite the butler's persistent requests, the Archduke did not respond to the situation. Only after Aaron reminded him of Clara's dozens of visits did Alexander consider whether it was worth his attention. Leaving the office, the butler felt a heavy burden, as his master had never had a serious relationship with a woman. Aaron suggested that Clara take a walk in the gardens to calm down, and she agreed without hesitation. Clara had begun to observe Alexander after a chance encounter with him at a horse-riding class last year. She fell in love with his slender and attractive figure when she saw him riding his horse. Although he was the commander of a large imperial order, Chloe was surprised by this information. The stories about his formidable reputation did not correspond to reality. His blue eyes seemed gentle, and his face was elegant. Alexandra's body was impressive in its strength and wildness, and no woman could ignore him. Clara was relieved to realize that he did not attend social gatherings, as his mysterious aura frightened the aristocratic ladies. No one could approach him, but she knew that his beauty would attract attention. Clara also felt that she could win him over because she was part of the Venderes family, which was second only to the Greys. Rumours spread in society about her frequent visits to the Archduke, as she was accustomed to marking her territory. Clara was famous for her fiery temper and, without knowing it, had gained a reputation as a crazy girl. At one point, smiling cheerfully, she remarked that roses, although beautiful, could not compare to her beauty. After some time, Jorge, the deputy head of the infirmary, began to have trouble sleeping again. This was due to the reorganization of the medicine warehouse, particularly the medicines whose purpose he could not understand. This made him wonder whether the slave girl had really been able to organize the medicines according to their properties. Most of the medicines were from Elpus, and due to delicate diplomatic relations with the Broken Kingdom, it was impossible to exchange medical supplies. Jorge decided to visit the warehouse to check again. His wife thought he had lost his mind, but even she could not stop his thirst for knowledge. Despite the late hour, he headed enthusiastically to the prison where Chloe was being held. The girl's life was simple and monotonous, and she regretted not being able to enjoy it. Having accepted her fate, she decided to seek happiness even in prison. Jorge's sudden visit surprised her a little, but she quickly understood why he had come. Jorge, fascinated by her knowledge of medicine, asked her questions, which Chloe answered eagerly. Their conversation lasted until morning. The man realized that he had found a real treasure in this slave, who was more than just a nobody. Their exchange of knowledge gave him the opportunity to change her fate. Jorge was no longer just researching medicine. He had stumbled upon a real human story and talent that could not go unnoticed. This was not the only job Jorge gave Chloe. In the evenings, she looked after Anna, Evan Kupfit's sister. She was more than 20 years younger than her brother. Anna was believed to have suffered from autism and insomnia since childhood. Erin came every day to help her because the whole family treated her with reverence. Chloe cleaned the medicine warehouse during the day and stayed with Anna at night until she fell asleep. Other nurses were responsible for caring for the lady, but no one wanted to do the job because her insomnia was incurable. Anna's parents, despite their love and efforts, had almost lost hope. At first, the girl was distrustful of Chloe, but over time, she opened up to her, seeing her sincerity and care. After a week of communication, Chloe learned that Anna's illness was congenital. Considering the girl's age, the slave decided to try light aromatherapy, which had previously helped her during her difficult marriage to Gilbert. She began to extract essential oils from plants herself, as noble women often used them for baths, but the scents of these oils were too strong. Chloe's aromatic oils were delicate and soothing. Anna enjoyed bathing in these oils, as she felt her headaches lessen and her sleep improve. Chloe was happy to help the girl, even though Lord Evan's status was a risk to her inconspicuous life. The Archduke went horseback riding with a friend for the first time in a long time. His beautiful black stallion, which he had raised himself, was stunning, and sensing his master's mood, he galloped energetically through the wind. The rugged cliffs did not stop them. Alexandros was the first to arrive at their destination, breathing in the clean mountain air. His father, Duncan Graham, had visited the mansion the day before. Formerly, the Graham estate belonged to Duncan, but after moving to the palace, the house came under Alexandros's complete control. Duncan rarely visited, so his son was sure that his father's visit had a hidden motive. Duncan wanted his son to marry, and in his desperation, tried to bribe everyone around him to achieve this goal. However, Alexander had no desire to tie his life to the Imperial court. Alexandro dreamed of joining a knightly order and conquering new lands, so he convinced his father to let him go on this journey. During his campaigns, Alexander took part in 6 major wars. He played an important role in the annexation of several countries to the empire. These heroic deeds made him a symbol of hope for many. But despite his fame and recognition, Alexandros did not seek power or status. After the war, he intended to return to the duchy and live peacefully, with no intention of visiting the capital. As the breeze played with his hair, he watched the company approaching him. Evan commented on the jump from the cliff, noting that it was risky. Alexandros replied that if he was destined to die jumping off a mountain, then perhaps he should not become emperor. The man, taken aback by the commander's frankness, did not know how to respond. Having experience communicating with Alexandros, Evan knew that behind the hero's appearance lay deep loneliness and a lack of emotional connections. His friend quickly rejoined the Archduke, feeling that their friendship was more important than any ambitions. They competed in a race where Evan had to take a risk and jump off a cliff to win. Anna noticed that her brother was nervous about family problems, so she decided to talk to him about aromatherapy, which could help him relax. Aaron, though hopeful, couldn't immediately trust the idea. Skeptical of procedures that were not traditional in the Empire, he doubted their usefulness. Chloe, however, said that it had always helped her mother calm down when they lived in a foreign country. This only increased Aaron's anxiety. He was afraid that the new oils could be addictive or cause dangerous reactions, so he decided not to trust this junk aromatherapy. Anna insisted that it could reduce his anxiety and improve his mood. Aaron felt the stress of the Archduke's marriage and his new circumstances weighing on him as if he were drowning in uncertainty, so he finally agreed. The warm water surrounding his body was like a gentle embrace, making him feel as if he had immersed himself in something magical. The scent that rose was new and unfamiliar, blending notes of sweetness and freshness. With each passing minute, Aaron felt his tension melt away. But when the maid's question pulled him out of his pleasant thoughts, he felt like he wanted to be left alone. The man felt a surge of energy and saw a reddish but more relaxed face in the mirror. Anna asked him how he felt, but Aaron evaded the question, not wanting to reveal his emotions. Anna also offered him some cold tea. Aaron hesitated, trying to maintain his pride and refuse women's drinks. But his sister's gaze, full of determination and trust, made him give in to temptation. He sipped the drink and felt it spread pleasantly inside him, giving him strength and energy. Aaron had to admit to himself that the aromatic bath and tea were not only pleasant, but also beneficial for him. Evan lay in bed and couldn't look his master in the eye as he sat in a soft armchair opposite him, quickly drinking 3 glasses of water, for the reason for his thirst was quite understandable. Alexandro came down the mountain with Evan on his back. Although his companion was smaller than the Archduke, holding a strong young man while leading 2 horses down the mountain was a difficult task. The problems began when the horse suddenly began to buck, causing the boy to fall and suffer serious injuries. The commander reported that he had sent the horse to the stable and that it would probably have to be put down the next day. The animal was a thoroughbred and had previously bred stallions for the Archduke, but most horses that threw their riders were put down. Evan was sad about the horse that had been with him for 10 years, but there was nothing he could do. He said he didn't know the reason for the incident, as it had happened so suddenly. But even despite his long history with Howl, Alexandros couldn't abandon an animal that had harmed his charge. Jorge understood well how important it was to rest, as the clean, fresh air of the garden was invigorating. However, even among the flowers, he and Chloe couldn't help but discuss medical matters. Their conversation sometimes resembled the chatter of schoolgirls, and sometimes the dialogue of doctors. When a doctor from the infirmary passed by, Jorge asked about Evan's condition, even though he had personally seen him fall asleep. He wanted to find out more about the patient, and when the doctor reassured him, Jorge continued his walk and explained the situation to Chloe. The girl suggested that a horse that had jumped with a man on its back would be killed. The man agreed, but noted that the Archduke would most likely wait until next week, as he had already requested an examination of the horse. Howl let out painful moans as he tried to stand up. He remembered the kind hands that gently stroked his back. Trying to approach his beloved, Howl fell again. The order to open the carriage came from Archduke Graham. His dominant presence forced the grooms to obey his every command without question. Alexandros gently stroked Howl's head, and the horse seemed to respond to his caress. The Archduke's horse, Xanthos, was Howl's son, with whom Alexandros had been friends since childhood. And since Duncan had proclaimed the boy the future emperor, this made it difficult for him to find loyal friends. Although the animal could not speak, It was always a wonderful companion for the Archduke, who longed for his father's love. Alessandro began riding him at the age of 10. During his first battle, Howl was seriously injured while saving his friend. This made Alexander feel guilty and grateful, pushing him to train harder to become stronger. The horse recovered, but despite his desire to return to riding, Alexander had to choose Xanthos. Evan, feeling sorry for the stallion, took him under his wing, which allowed the Archduke to see his friend more often. But the sight of the animal now saddened Alexandros. He knew that he would soon die. The man stroked his mane, realizing that he could not save his friend, but wanting Howl's last days to be happy. With heavy steps, the Archduke set off for the capital, even though he dreamed of leaving that place behind forever. Chloe and Jorge headed for the stables, after which the groom led them to a huge and luxurious building. When the slave girl entered, she was struck by the size of the stables and the quality of the premises. She smiled, thinking that it was much better than the slaves' quarters. Following the coachman, Chloe noticed a black stallion. The animal was breathing heavily, looking extremely exhausted, and the blood from its nose only added to its suffering. Chloe felt deep pity for the stallion, whose fate had been ruined by hard labor. Jorge, observing her reaction, explained that Howl was extremely beautiful, even to Chloe's untrained eye. His shiny skin, despite his terrible condition, made him look like a precious black pearl. The horse looked truly unusual, which aroused even more sympathy in the slave girl. Jorge noted that the animal must have drunk water from the river near Mount Nalusuan, where Lord Kupfit had let it go for a short time. The unfortunate stallion had probably eaten something forbidden there, which had led to his condition. Jorge added that Nalusuan was famous for its poisonous plants, which is why no one was allowed to enter. That was why there weren't many animals in that area. The idea of prohibiting entry to Nalusuan was foreign to Chloe. In her native Elpus, none of the areas were closed for such reasons, and the mountains had always served the people well. If there were poisonous plants near the rocks, there must be a way to counteract them. These thoughts ran through her head. However, Chloe had to go in search of the cause herself, but on the condition that she would return. The mountain was located not far from the capital. Chloe examined the rare plants, feeling very impressed. The terrain was rocky, but the peaks were low compared to those she had climbed before. The survey took longer than Chloe had hoped. When she reached the top, she saw anchor flowers. Finally, having gathered quite a few, she realized she had forgotten her bag and decided to put them in her pants. It looked awkward, but she didn't care. As the slave girl descended the mountain, her pants were overflowing with flowers, and she looked like a clown. On the horizon, Chloe saw the stable boy resting under a tree. Approaching him, she asked about her bag. The groom, seeing her dirty pants, doubted her sanity. He said there was no bag, which upset Chloe, but the thought of the stallion made her move faster. When the slave girl reached the stable, she was stopped by a guard, as prior permission was required to enter. The stable boy, who was with Chloe, explained that she was following Dr. Jorge's orders, and she was allowed to pass. The girl stepped into the stable and saw that the stallion was still alive, though breathing heavily. She promised him that everything would be fine and began to take the plants out of her pants to feed him. The guard asked again if Dr. George had really given such an order. Sensing danger, he did not allow Chloe to feed the horse, took the plant and went to check the information, locking her in a cage. Chloe looked anxiously at the horse, which was slowly dying, fighting for its life. Suddenly, the guard approached and said that he had locked her up for a moment because she was feeding Howl strange grass. The girl turned her head toward the noise and saw the guard and the aristocrat watching the horse closely. She recognized the great Archduke, the very man who wanted her dead. At that moment, her heart froze, and she involuntarily lowered her head, feeling a tremor throughout her body. Despite being dressed in simple dark clothes, the Archduke looked surprisingly stylish. It seemed that Alexander's charm came from his handsome face, although he looked wonderful in any outfit. For a moment, she forgot about her critical situation, but the sounds around her brought her back to reality. The guard asked the girl harshly about her plans. Chloe said that she was trying to save the horse by giving it an antidote. The Archduke looked at her contemptuously, as if she were a useless object, and the slave girl lowered her gaze. The girl was laughed at, her knowledge of horses being questioned. Chloe was confused, but she realized that the Archduke did not remember her past, even though he had a name that inspired fear. Pulling herself together, she said that she was studying medicine with Dr. Jorge George, and that the horse had eaten poisonous plants in Nalusuvani. The guard thought Chloe was out of her mind, but the Archduke did not respond to this assumption. He turned to the slave girl and asked if she could save the horse. She bowed her head and replied confidently that she could. Unable to see his face, she could not understand what was going through his mind. The guard, puzzled, began to speak, but the Archduke interrupted him, telling Chloe that if Howl died, she would die too. This shocked her. She realized that her life meant no more to him than the life of a horse. The slave realized that he could dispose of both of them as if they were mere objects. However, despite the threat, she promised to do everything she could. In the end, Chloe got a chance to save the stallion. The girl approached Howl without looking up, felt his heavy breathing and reflexively pulled her hand back. Determined, she untied her belt and slipped her hand into his pants to take more herbs. The guard asked in shock how she could do such a thing in front of His Highness. She flinched, but continued to unwrap the herbs and explained that she didn't have a bag, so she used her pants. Alexandra was puzzled. He was surprised at how natural Chloe was, unlike other women who looked perfect on the outside, but were greedy and hypocritical on the inside. They always protected their interests and knew how to hide their true emotions behind a mask of affection. Chloe carefully brought the leaves to the horse's mouth, hoping that it would help him regain his strength. All her fears and worries disappeared for a moment as she watched the stallion eat what she had offered him, and hope for salvation filled her heart. Alexander continued to watch the little slave girl. Without a trace of pride or shame, Chloe behaved like a man, or even worse. Her short, unkempt hair and loose clothing made her look less like a woman, despite her slender legs and rounded breasts. Chloe, overcome with panic, tried to calm Howl by gently stroking his head. She squeezed the grass to extract the juice and held it to the horse's nose, hoping that the scent would attract him. When the stallion suddenly sighed heavily, she instantly pulled her hand away, but, gathering her strength, offered the grass again. Howl's inner struggle gradually subsided, and his gaze became focused on Chloe. He sniffed the plant carefully, as if contemplating its scent. When the smell intrigued him, Chloe, encouraging herself, cautiously brought them to the animal's mouth. Then the horse eagerly bit into the girl's fingers. This moment was new to Chloe, as she had never been so close to a horse before. She gathered some more herbs and continued to feed them to the stallion. Alexander watched the scene with displeasure. The slave girl seemed tense, her movements uncertain. If she managed to save Howl, the situation could change. The Archduke was intelligent, so if the horse had been poisoned, he was not to blame for Evan's suffering. At the same time, the desire to save his friend became his top priority, and he continued to watch Chloe work. The slave girl said that the horse she was caring for had eaten all the herbs she had gathered. She was ready to continue caring for him and watching him recover. Alexander asked how long it would take for the horse to fully recover. Chloe replied that it could take up to 2 weeks. After the Archduke left the stable, the guard ordered Chloe not to leave the animal, as she was responsible for its safety. Chloe asked the guard to relay a message to Lady Anna. Given the circumstances, she would not be able to serve her until she finished her work in the stable. Chloe realized that it was much better here than where the other slaves lived. Although she was worried about Anna, the real source of her anxiety was her encounter with the Archduke, which had left a deep scar on her memory. 2 months ago, at the ball, she was an elegant princess. But now, dressed as a slave, she hoped that Alexander would not recognize her. Chloe realized that it was better to remain inconspicuous because she was afraid of attracting attention more than anything else. The girl was deeply distressed by the difficult circumstances she was facing. She wanted to return to her normal life in the pharmacy, as well as continue to care for her horse and collect herbs. Finding herself in a warm atmosphere, surrounded by soft hay, she decided not to think about her problems and worries, focusing instead on regaining her strength, because she knew that this was the best way to a peaceful future. While climbing the mountain, Trigger felt bored and decided to strike up a conversation with Chloe, a slave girl who was studying medicine under Jorge and was bustling around trying to heal the horse. Chloe shared her experience, saying that she had once been a slave in a pharmacy where she had gained knowledge that now helped her in her work as a doctor. Trigger nodded, but doubted her words, although he thought that even though she was a slave, Jorge valued her. The stable guard asked him to keep an eye on Chloe because they would both die if she escaped. He recommended keeping her on a leash, but Trigger did not consider this necessary. When they reached the cliff, Chloe began to look for anchor flowers. The coachman was amazed by the beauty of the landscape below, as he had never been so high up before. The slave girl concentrated on gathering the flowers, hoping to return to the stable as soon as possible, where a lot of work awaited her. It turned out that the horse looked much better than before. Chloe happily began to feed him grass, feeling proud of what she had done. Suddenly, Dr. George approached, interested in Chloe's condition. He noticed that she looked dirty and wounded, but at least he was pleased to see her smiling face. Chloe, touched by his attention, tried not to show her feelings for fear of becoming dependent on a man. They talked at length about the horse's condition and medical problems in the Empire. The girl believed that Nosteros did not pay enough attention to the development of sisterhood and medicine compared to Elpus. She wondered if wars could be the reason for such indifference. When Jorge left, Chloe felt proud of her achievements. She thought about Lady Anna, who was probably worried about her, and about her plans for storing the medicine. All this exhausted her so much that she fell asleep next to the horse. Alexandra returned to the stables a day later, and seeing the slave girl sleeping in broad daylight was speechless. The other workers were busy preparing for dinner while she slept peacefully. He did not want to deal with such a lazy girl, because despite giving her a chance, his dissatisfaction remained. The reason for his return to the stable was his lack of trust in Chloe. He was wary of her explanation for Howl's illness, so he did not leave the animal's treatment to her discretion. What bothered him most was that she seemed very comfortable sleeping on the hay. Alexandra considered waking the slave girl and questioning her, but ultimately decided against it. Usually the guards had no trouble with her, but now Chloe lay there, her limbs limp. The Archduke also noticed that Howl looked much healthier, and the nosebleeds that had been troubling them for several days had suddenly stopped. In addition, he seemed more cheerful. Alexandro thought that everything was moving in the right direction. He did not feel the need to punish the slave girl now and decided to wait a few days, watching her. Everything indicated that she had kept her promise. Without Aaron's knowledge, the Archduke hinted to his father that he had no intention of marrying. He was not interested in women and did not want to become a victim of marriage arrangements. He was the product of such a marriage of convenience. His relationship with Sophia Macaulay, Alexander's mother, became known thanks to the union of the two most influential families in the Empire. Duncan, ambitious and daring, had a deal in his marriage contract. It stipulated that only one male heir, Alexander, would be born. Thanks to this union, Duncan gained enormous power, military might, and wealth that brought him close to imperial status. His goal was to take the throne. Sophia, however, also aspired to become the first ruling empress and was obsessed with her ambition. Alexandra was merely a means to an end and later became an obstacle. She despised her husband and son, believing that their existence stood in the way of her dreams. Alexandro endured countless sufferings, listening to his mother's screams. Eventually, Sophia was caught trying to murder her husband. Duncan, not wanting to ruin his relationship with his wife's family, sent her to prison. But she escaped, taking Alexander with her, and began blackmailing her husband, using her son as a hostage. The boy was only 11 years old at the time, and the horrors of that night at the estate were forever etched in his memory. He felt his mother's embrace only once when she, filled with hatred, held a knife to his throat. Sophia declared that the years she had spent married to a man she did not love, and with a child she did not want, had been nothing but pain. To protect his son, Duncan killed Sophia in front of Alexander and threw her body out of the palace. Now the Archduke could not get rid of the memories of this tragedy, no matter how much he wanted to. After these events, he joined a knightly order and began to wander the battlefields. Duncan had mixed feelings about Alexander, which led to his decision to renounce the throne and leave his family home. Father and son rarely saw each other and communicated even less. The man felt guilt and compassion for his son, wanting to give him everything. However, Alexandros did not blame his father for the tragedy. Raised among greedy aristocrats, he grew tired of feeling resentful. Despite his coldness, the Archduke became a mature personality. As a child, Alexander often dreamed of how his life would have changed if his parents had been simple people, content with their lot. He believed that this would have brought him happiness, regardless of social status. However, as an adult, he realized that without his mother and father and their ambition, he would not exist at all. Once again observing his senseless thoughts, he smiled to himself. Getting to his feet, he headed for the training ground, as it was the only way to cope with his complex emotions. It was a temporary solution, but it helped him the most. Duncan carefully read the report that had been sent to him for review. He realized that working with Imperial documents required a lot of effort. However, at that moment, he was paying more attention to matters closer to home. The report stated that Alexandros often stayed at his estate and training center, meeting only a few people each day. Although he maintained relationships with all the commanders, he paid special attention to some of them. At the top of the list was Evan Cupfit, a name familiar to Duncan. He had the best chance of being close to the prince. The man continued to read the report with interest. According to the information, Evan and His Highness met almost every day for training and walks. Sometimes they were seen in fairly close contact. This alarmed Duncan, as Evan was married. He tried to recall details of the man's personal life and realized that he had married a girl from an insignificant family, and they had 2 children. Duncan sighed deeply and tried to calm himself by imagining Evan as he appeared, mostly an ordinary man. Then he continued reviewing the list. He quickly realized that because of his son's young age, most of the commanders were significantly older than him. One name caught his attention: Chris Scalawag, a young knight recently appointed commander of the 2nd Squadron. He wasn't particularly close to anyone, but it seemed that Alexandro had a special connection with Chris. This was confirmed by rumors that they had repeatedly taken baths together in the open air. The emperor felt an indescribable discomfort and tried to tear himself away from reading. He couldn't imagine that his son could have such a relationship. Sighing, Duncan called his trusted servant Humphrey. The emperor asked him to imagine that he had 3 sons, although Humphrey was actually unmarried. Duncan reasoned that he valued his youngest son the most, although the eldest was ambitious and the middle one was intelligent. He really needed his servant's advice, so he asked if Humphrey would stop his youngest son from going on a trip to see his sweetheart. Humphrey didn't get the hint, but said he'd respect his son's wishes. Duncan's expectations were not met, so he sent Humphrey away. He continued to ponder the unusual problems his son was facing. Humphrey realized that their conversation had left questions unanswered, but he did not dare to ask them, leaving his master alone with his thoughts. And so began the combat tournament, which aroused wild enthusiasm throughout the empire. The first night promised to be loud and sleepless. The tournament lasted a week and ended with the knighting of the newly promoted fencers and the departure of the army on a ceremonial expedition. Alexandro, who had always loved quiet places, felt uncomfortable when the aristocrats began to approach him at the party. Lord Vendors, Clara's father, was particularly intrusive. He declared that the Archduke and his daughter were engaged. However, this angered Alexander because the agreement had been made by his father Duncan and had nothing to do with his wishes. Therefore, the lord should not get his hopes up. In the stables, which were much larger than the ballroom, the Archduke noticed Chloe. The slave girl was asleep again, which alarmed him. Alexander suspected that she was trying to avoid him. He also noticed Howl. The horse looked healthy and lively, as if it had no illnesses. The slave girl had made herself comfortable on a pile of hay. Despite her worn clothes and short hair, as well as the cuts on her face and hands, her skin glowed. Alexandra was intrigued by the fact that her hair was not dark brown like his, but black, which was rare on the continent. The guard asked if he should wake the girl, but the Archduke stopped him. Chloe had saved a horse from death, which intrigued him, and although he found her very suspicious, he couldn't help but notice her. The guard confirmed that the slave spoke their language with a slight accent. He noted that the girl was from the house of Kupfit, not from the infirmary. Alexandro knew that slaves were usually captured there during wars. What alarmed him most was the lord's desire to return the girl quickly. After all, it was unusual for an aristocrat close to him to take an interest in a slave. The guard assured him that although the girl might look like a boy, she was definitely a girl. Alexandra looked closely at her features, feeling curious but decided not to wake her. Chloe noticed the commander through her sleep, and pretending to be asleep turned to the other side. Both Alexandros and Trigger thought this was a very bold move, but the girl's heart was beating so fast that she couldn't help herself. Chloe woke up in the stable, where she had already spent 5 days. The guard asked her if she planned to go to Nalusuan today and said he would follow Trigger. She thanked him gratefully. Communicating with the guards and stable hands became easier for the girl, although at first their distrust made her feel uncomfortable. However, the changes in Howl's condition improved their attitude, and she felt their friendliness. Chloe learned that the Archduke had visited again while she was asleep. She felt ashamed, realizing that he saw her in such moments. But on the other hand, face-to-face communication frightened her. An inner voice told her that if the Archduke really cared, he would have woken her up. Even if she was in danger, she would rather die in her sleep than go through the horrors that had befallen Alicia. As she stroked the horse, she was overwhelmed by anxious thoughts about meeting the Archduke. Although his presence had frightened her before, she now realized that he was unlikely to kill her, even if she fell asleep early. Rumors about the Archduke's family testified to their influence in the empire. Chloe understood that although aristocrats considered themselves chosen, the Archduke's power required nobility, not cruelty. It was said that the Rem family never broke their promises, and she noticed honesty in his voice. Reflecting on Alexander's character, Chloe felt hopeful that he might be a good man. While the Imperial court was preparing for the tournament, Chloe met a stable boy who was pleasantly surprised by Howl's condition. They discussed the horse's recovery, and Chloe felt proud of her charge. Trigger, watching the horse, hinted at his importance. Their conversations had been light-hearted in the past, but today Chloe remembered their trips to the cliff, where his jokes had lifted her spirits and dispelled her anxiety. When the slave girl thought about her upcoming meeting with the Archduke, she was overcome with fear. She tried to convince herself that sleep would help her avoid communication, but thoughts of it kept her tense. The second day of the tournament, when the battles began, was even more intense than the opening ceremony. This was because on this day, Alexandros Graham, hero of the Empire and son of Duncan, was the center of attention. The Archduke was tired of tedious formalities, so he only attended the mandatory events, skipping the parties. Aaron, their organizer, was upset, but he couldn't go against his master's will. At night, Alexander ran away to the stables again, remembering how he had asked the guard about the slave girl the day before. He realized that the girl had probably been ordered not to sleep and to wait for him. However, contrary to his initial desire to question the suspicious girl, he hoped that she was already asleep. The man sought refuge, isolated from the world, where he could rest with Howl, as he had done in previous days. Around midnight, only a few people remained in the stables. They quickly jumped up when they saw the Archduke trying to follow him, but he decided to take only one guard and quietly made his way to Howl. The man apologized profusely to Alexander and said that he had seen the girl wake up early in the evening, but had apparently fallen asleep again while waiting. This mishap did not bother Alexander too much. He ordered the gate to be opened and, entering the enclosure, met the stallion's gaze. The horse, demonstrating his health, rubbed against the Archduke's hands. It seemed as if he wanted to leave the stable and run as he once had. He no longer looked sickly, as he had the previous week, and Alexander felt proud of his recovery. Looking into Howl's eyes, he asked the guard if he could run. The man confirmed that the stallion was eager to be free. Alexander, enjoying the sight of Howl, then left the enclosure and looked into the neighboring cage where the slave girl was sleeping. The servant immediately asked if he should wake her, but, as expected, the Archduke decided not to disturb the girl. Instead, he asked if anyone had noticed anything unusual about her behavior. The man took advantage of the moment to complain. He noted that the girl ate more than the average stable boy and boldly walked around Nalusuvan, despite her modest and feminine build. The guard also noticed that the girl looked strange, spoke like a real lady, and seemed to know something about medicine. When one of the stable boys was injured, she was able to stop the bleeding using herbs. At first, they thought Chloe had just picked the plants by accident, but her knowledge impressed everyone. Alexandros listened carefully, trying to find out more about the mysterious girl. He eventually realized that this slave girl was beginning to arouse his suspicion, and he was increasingly drawn to her mystery. The guard was surprised by the sudden change of topic to the number of horses for the ceremonial expedition. He replied that they planned to bring about 20, even though only 10 commanders were participating in the expedition itself. In addition, they were also going to take 10 spare horses. Given the aristocratic status of many of the commanders, horses supplied on short notice were not suitable for them. The animals were a source of pride, and serious injuries were upsetting. The commander ordered that Howl be tested for his ability to run. Although the stallion looked healthier than ever, Alexandros could not approve of his participation in the expedition until he was sure that he had recovered. He had a feeling that the expedition would have a significant impact on everything. He didn't understand why he felt that way. Perhaps it was a silly thought, given the silence in the stables, which contrasted sharply with the hubbub of the festival. Despite his role in keeping peace on the continent, Alexandros felt uneasy. Jorge learned that Chloe was now locked in the stables, and this saddened him deeply. He looked as if he had received a terrible sentence, for Archduke Graham had just announced that the slave girl would be joining the expedition. The doctor had planned to return her to the pharmacy once she had finished her business with Howl. He had dreamed of creating a catalogue of medicines for the Empire for so long that this was an unexpected and painful blow. The Archduke, Grand Master of the Order of Knights, brooked no argument, so Jorge could not refuse him. He consoled himself with the thought that the expedition would not last more than a year, after which they would return to their duties. However, the realization that Chloe was going on a journey caused him anxiety, although it could also be a wonderful opportunity for her to demonstrate her skills and find her place in the infirmary. The man was deeply concerned about Chloe's position in society. Despite her great knowledge, she was still a slave. When discussing her medical abilities, Jorge pointed out that she was just like any other doctor. The Archduke listened attentively, then laughed, emphasizing Jorge's excessive modesty. He spoke of Chloe's ability to use medicinal plants, noting that her experience was more valuable than his. The Archduke learned for the first time that the girl's name was Chloe. Jorge was surprised, because Alessandro did not know the name of the slave girl chosen for the expedition. Then the butler, Aaron Kupfit, burst into the office with news. Aaron announced that the information about the feudal lord's military strength had been confirmed. Jorge thought about the man's fate and his life path, as he had given up city life in favor of serving the Archduke. Continuing his conversation with the Archduke, the doctor planned to invite Chloe to join the expedition. However, the butler suddenly interrupted them and asked about a black-haired girl who looked like a boy. Jorge was impressed by Aaron's detailed description of Chloe. Alexander, on the other hand, recalled that the butler often asked about the slave girl, which aroused his curiosity and led him to believe that the butler had feelings for her. Then, when Chloe was confirmed for the expedition, the Archduke noticed that Aaron's face suddenly changed, causing him even more concern. Although he was only interested in her help in taking a pleasant bath. Under severe stress due to his master's presence, the butler waited for the tournament to end and for Alexandros to finally leave. Jorge and the Archduke, seeing Aaron's distress, did not ask about the cause of his anxiety. The butler asked if Chloe would be taken on as a maid. Jorge, trying to intercede, pointed out that her medical skills could be useful. The Archduke planned to assign her to the infirmary to look after the horses. The knights on the expedition spent most of their time on horseback, and wounded animals were replaced from neighboring territories. But the commander's horses needed special attention, as their health was important to the order. Aaron realized that the question of Chloe's participation in the trip had probably already been decided. He tried to convince the Archduke to take the girl as his personal maid, fearing that she would remain in the infirmary forever. He also mentioned that the slave girl had previously looked after his sister Anna, performing her duties admirably. Aaron noted her ability to treat wounds, give massages, and her useful experience in the stables caring for Xanthos. While the men were defending their interests regarding Chloe, Alexandrus ignored their demands, ordering the chamberlain to act at his own discretion. The latter felt satisfied with his victory and bowed his head to the Archduke. Jorge was defeated, but he was not too upset, as he considered Chloe's participation in the campaign a great honor. So, without the girl's knowledge, she was to be sent on a nightly expedition, which was to begin in 2 days. Alexandra returned home early in the morning, after a long night spent in his study. Fortunately, no one was waiting for him in the living room. He headed for his bedroom, feeling an unpleasant sense that something was wrong. Upon entering the room, he immediately smelled a woman's perfume. There was another person in his bedroom. Lady Clara Vendors was sitting on a chair next to the bed. Her sweet and friendly smile repelled the Archduke. The sight of a woman who had invaded his personal space without his permission, revealing her desire for more than the wealth she already possessed, filled Alexander with disgust. Clara watched as the Archduke took off his coat. The thought that they would be alone aroused a strong desire in her. She was confident that she could possess him, for her beauty and lineage made her special. No man, not even the most famous war hero, could resist her. When the woman approached the Archduke, he expressed his displeasure at her intrusion. Despite the cold reception, Clara tried to seduce Alexander by touching his body, but the Archduke did not succumb to her charms and suddenly lifted her up, roughly pushing her onto the bed. Shocked by his behavior, Clara tried to kiss him, but he dodged her again. The man's determination only angered her, and she realized that she had never encountered such behavior before. Feeling powerless under the Archduke's control, the woman understood what kind of man she was dealing with. Releasing Clara, she tried to get up, but Alexander grabbed her by the legs again and pulled her back. In an instant, her dress was torn, and she felt horror at the man's aggressive actions. Lifting her underskirt, he caused her pain by hitting her buttocks, and Clara felt anger and disappointment at the Archduke's indifference. Tears streamed down the woman's face, and she was sure she could not remain in such humiliation. There was a threat in his voice that she had not heard before, and his gaze made her realize that he had no respect for her. Without answering, Clara, overcome with shock and humiliation, left the room under the pressure of the Archduke's narcissism. It turned out that Duncan had allowed all the aristocratic women to visit his son in order to seduce him. Gilbert, with his thick hand, grabbed the broken railing, feeling the rings on his fingers hit the stone. He looked around the former palace of Elpus, which now belonged to him. The empire did not hold colonies, but absorbed all the defeated countries. The Chancellor submitted to the policy and accepted all the citizens of Elpus as his feudal subjects. Although some refused to serve him, they all remained slaves, regardless of their previous status. It was a harsh dictatorial system, and the people no longer resisted. The leaders and relatives of the overthrown kingdom died along with the royal family. The citizens and aristocracy were waiting for a leader to obey. Gilbert was considered the only one who could rule the new territory. Looking at the ruins of war, he suddenly slammed his hand on the railing. He was outraged by the contempt shown to him by Duncan Graham, who did not even show up at the ceremony to award Gilbert his new title. Gilbert was appointed Marquis of the Kingdom as Duncan's nameless servant, which caused him incredible irritation. Although Duncan was not emperor, he delegated the ceremony to his subordinate. The Chancellor believes that his achievements in the conquest of Elpus were not properly appreciated. After meeting with the self-proclaimed emperor, his requests for a new meeting remained unanswered and unexplained. The power and fame of the self-proclaimed emperor irritated the Chancellor. Thanks to a successful coup against the weak emperor, Duncan consolidated his position through the achievements of his son, Alexander. Gilbert did not want to sit and wait for change. To maintain his unfortunate position, he was forced to constantly draw attention to himself. He remembered his betrayed wife Beatrice and hoped that she was dead. Chloe was overcome with despair when she learned that she had to join a solemn expedition that was to start the next day. It was part of a major event to boost the morale of new soldiers and control the feudal lords. The girl couldn't believe that she had been assigned to be part of this event. She felt completely helpless, as she had recently become accustomed to the idea that her place was in the stables, far from imperial affairs. The stable boy tried to cheer her up by telling her about the Archduke's charisma, but Chloe disagreed. She didn't understand why she had been chosen for this service, as she hadn't seen Alexander since Howl's treatment. It seemed that the Emperor himself had no reason to show any interest in her. Chloe felt that she would not be able to cope with this task when Trigger began to drag her to the Archduke's estate. She had already planned to avoid meeting him, even pretending to be asleep during his visits. However, life suddenly forced her to embark on a difficult journey alongside a man she would rather avoid. When they finally arrived at the estate, Chloe remained silent, feeling panic rising within her. Aaron, whom they met in his office, began his instructions from the very first minute, restrained and stern. The slave girl was shocked by the events and could barely take in the information he was giving her. Soon, the senior maid Sandra approached them and began to instruct Chloe incessantly about her duties. Sandra explained to her that the Archduke did not like to be touched or disturbed while bathing. Therefore, Chloe must follow all instructions. These words about failure and punishment frightened the slave girl. She was well aware of who her new master was, and understood that she had to diligently fulfill his demands to avoid the Archduke's wrath, as this could endanger Aaron and Sandra. The day passed in tension for Chloe. She felt the terrible thought of her new role beginning to eat away at her from the inside, and her only hope was that she would not have to face failure. Her main duties were to prepare the Archduke's clothes, make his bed, and clean his sword every day. Since Chloe had never worked as a maid before, she was very nervous. With each task, the girl realized that her life had changed dramatically. Sandra, as if reading Chloe's thoughts, told her not to try to do a bad job if she wanted to keep her head on her shoulders. Fortunately, Anna was in good health. Chloe told her about the past events and the unexpected invitation to join the expedition. The girl reassured her slave, emphasizing how honorable it was to participate in such an event. She knew that the whole empire was talking about this trip and expressed her envy at the opportunity to travel across the continent with handsome knights. Chloe was confused and didn't know what to say. Breaking the silence, Anna added that she was only saying this because Chloe would be the Archduke's personal maid. She added that although he was her brother's master and a hero of the empire, she was still concerned for her friend's safety. The girl quietly continued that her maid's friend was looking after Lady Clara, and according to rumors, something disturbing had happened yesterday. Her voice softened as she reported that His Highness had attacked the woman. Chloe's eyes widened when she heard Anna mention the Archduke's possible propensity for violence against women. The girl anxiously placed her hands on Chloe's shoulders, trying to support her. Mrs. Kupfit asked her to keep this a secret, because if Aaron found out, he would punish his sister. Alexander had developed a habit of beating women during his frequent military campaigns, so Anna wished her friend luck. The combat tournament finally began, and everyone cheerfully saw the knights off. Chloe, as the Archduke's maid, walked at the head of the parade. The discomfort in her head gradually subsided amid the crowd and the excited participants of the expedition. She stole a glance at the man sitting next to her on horseback, and realizing that he did not see her, slowly raised her head. She had never looked at him so closely before. Archduke Graham rode Xanthos, his huge horse covered with a shiny saddlecloth. Alexandro looked as strong and powerful as his magnificent animal. The man's profile was captivating in its perfection. He resembled a graceful knight in shining armor on a black stallion, as if from a fairy tale. Every detail emphasized his status as one of the most powerful men in the empire. Dark brown hair, blue eyes, thick eyebrows, a sharp nose, and sensual lips gave him the appearance of a handsome and noble man. But Chloe knew that appearances could be deceiving. The slave girl quickly lowered her head, afraid that the Archduke might notice her gaze. This was their first meeting since the day he ordered her to follow Howl, and although she was just walking beside him, she found it extremely difficult not to focus on his face. Chloe wanted to start the journey with a smile, like the rest, but as soon as they left the capital, it became more difficult. The knights rode on horseback, while Chloe and the grooms were forced to walk, keeping pace with the horses. Although no one complained, the march was not easy. They were later informed that they would only stop twice a day, once for lunch and once for dinner at night. The commanders were housed in the castles of local feudal lords or aristocrats. Meanwhile, the knights and lower-ranking servants camped out in the open on woolen blankets. In the absence of houses, the commanders slept in tents. Chloe had never had such an experience before, so she was confused. Fortunately, Heidi, Duke Valer's maid, came to her aid. The woman informed her that the Archduke's tent had already been set up, so she advised Chloe to prepare a bed for sleeping and bring towels. Alexandra's appearance confused Heidi. She thought that the Archduke had taken a man with him on the expedition as his personal servant. Chloe smiled awkwardly and pointed out that she was a girl, but in fact, she was pleased to hear this. She had not been able to get a haircut before leaving, so she was worried that her hair had grown too long and would give away her identity. Although several months had passed, Chloe was still terribly afraid that Alexander would recognize her. On top of that, she had new obsessive thoughts. What if the Archduke would mock her or raise his hand against her?